welcome to today's web conference, We Govern in Practice, Narrating a Future for Our Communities. This is a web conference that is the Resonance Network and Prevent Connect working together. And so really glad to be able to see so many of you joining us from many different time zones. So thank you all for having you join us. So I just want to highlight that this has been part of a series of web conferences that we have done with Resonance, that Prevent Connect has done with Resonance Network. And there's a great wealth of information and recordings that are available. Go ahead. We're putting those in the text chat, or you can get them on the website. We have recordings of all of these web conferences. And so I just want to encourage you to be able to do it, whether it's going to be looking at an introduction to Resonance Network, looking at the art of storytelling with Black organizers, or planting the seeds of community, or reimagining a world without sexual violence. And this has been part of our series that we've been doing on WeGovern. And so I'm really glad that we're continuing this conversation about the WeGovern principles. So the objectives of today's session is that by the end of the session, we're looking for all the people who are participating to be able to describe how a commitment to WeGovern agreements can transform the stories we create about our shared future, to identify where you already are in practice while operating together differently to envision and create communities where all beings can thrive, and to discuss opportunities to see, feel, and plan for a future beyond violence in concrete ways by drawing on ancestral wisdom and embodied ways of knowing. So I am really honored to be able to co-host this with my good friend, Alexis Flanagan from Resonance Network. And so Alexis, let's go ask a question of the audience. What is your vision for a world beyond violence? This is such a guiding concept of Resonance Network, isn't it?
It is. We can't get there if we can't see where we're going. And so what is our vision? What do we dream possible in a world beyond violence?
Great. So please go ahead and write in the text chat, what is your vision for a world beyond violence? So I know people are writing right now. So where policies and system change happen with women rather than to them. Thriving. Oh, go ahead, Alexis.
Thriving versus surviving.
A world where we prevent and heal pain and trauma in order to stop violence before it happens.
Humans are experienced in sharing power.
Whole and healing communities. Great, thanks. Go ahead, keep on sharing. Oh, where people stop victim blaming, where everyone has the skills and capacity to be accountable for their own actions and engage in repair and healing. Also, no police or prison systems.
A world committed to rest and restoration, where all people can live their best lives full of joy, art, love.
Normalize Blackness and healing and repair. So I'm seeing these themes, Alexis, that there's themes that really are emerging in what people are sharing.
Thank you so much for contributing your vision for a world without violence. And please continue to add to the chat as we go along, as ideas percolate in you, as images come to you. Feel free to continue to share them as we're talking today.
So Alexis, why don't you talk a little bit about what the WeGovern principles are and what WeGovern is?
Yeah, thank you, David. So we've been in a conversation with this audience in Prevent Connect for some time now about this question about what is the world that we see beyond violence. We've been engaging and imagining and shaping that vision together. And from that vision Then we have, in fall of 2020, Resonance Network launched a set of principles into the world to invite people to say that if that's the world that we want to live in, and if we have a critical mass of people that are engaged in this bold vision of this world that we're for, then how are we going to have to be together? What would need to be true for us to bring this world into being? And so WeGovern is a set of principles that people get ooh over the word governance, right? We have an association with the word governance. But when we're talking about governance, we're talking about the process by which people determine what are the norms and the rules that guide our everyday life. How are we going to be together? What will our behavior be? How will we choose to live together? How will we recognize and uphold each other's well-being and freedom? Some of the elements of this vision, of the vision that folks are adding in the chat, are part of that, right? How do we build capacity to hold ourselves accountable, right? And to reckon with harm that we may cause? How do we choose to use our resources together, build systems and structures together? These are questions that we need to be able to answer, these are the specifics of our vision that we need to be able to drill down into in order to claim collective agency over our lives and over our ability to shape the conditions in which we live. And so we launched this in fall of 2020. Hundreds of you signed on, hundreds of folks signed on, and we've been in a conversation over the last several times that we have visited with Prevent Connect to bring more and more elements and pieces of living into these principles into the fore. And so today I'm really, really thrilled that our beloved teachers, my beloved teachers, Norma Wong and Malia Collins are joining us today, and they're going to introduce themselves in just a minute in the way that our guests of Resonance and Prevent Connect have been introducing themselves, by telling story. Why? Because story connects us as human beings, right? And so as we're moving through and we're thinking about this set of agreements and how these set of agreements move from ideas to actually having impact and shaping our lives and our world, we're going to be in story, and we're going to be talking about story, and we're going to be talking about the importance of being able to narrate into this vision that you all have shared in the chat, this vision that we hold together, the vision that may just be a seed that's in our bellies that is still just trying to germinate and trying to get that sprout to break through that that outer layer. So the principles, as they have been existing in the world, they're beginning to live in our bones. That's just the beginning. And what we have in front of us today is an opportunity to think about, how do we live these principles? And part of being able to live them is to tell a big enough story to inspire yourself, number one, to live into it, and to inspire others so that these principles also shape our actions. So David, I'm so excited to bring our guests in today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's go ahead and have you introduce yourselves by story. And so we're going to be starting with who is starting?
Malia.
Hello, everybody. Aloha mai kako, o Malia ko uinoa, no mauna wili mai au. O Hank Gellert, ko u makua kane, a me aloha makai moku, ko u makua hine. Make au, I ka moana, e na mauna. Mahalo ana kupuna, mahalo ana akua. And I introduced myself in Hawaii, and I'm from Hawaii, born and raised. And I told you my name, Malia, and where I grew up is a valley called Monowili. I brought my father and my mother into the room. I told you that I love ocean and mountains, and I shared my thanks and my gratitude and grace for my kupuna, for my elders, for my ancestors, and also for spirit. Good morning, everybody. My name's Malia, and I'm from Hawaii, but I'm calling in from Boise, Idaho, the ancestral lands of the Shoshone-Bannock people. And when I was thinking about introducing myself for today, I was remembering a conversation that I had during the summer with folks from residence. And we were talking about different ways to tell our stories. And somebody talked about the idea of different kinds of punctuation when we're telling our stories, and my ears perked up since I'm a writing and English professor. And it was a different way to think about punctuation and the idea of punctuating our stories in a moment or in a place, and those moments and experience in our stories that punctuate the stories that we're telling. And so I have been paying attention to those different kinds of punctuations, from the sound of the wind or the rain or the color of the sky outside, a voice that I hear from behind me or beside me. And they remind me to pay attention. And in that paying attention, the stories that can arrive. And I'm so thrilled to be here. And I'm gonna pass it to my friend Norma.
Aloha, aloha Emilia, aloha mai kako, aloha mai. Good morning, friends. It is morning for most of us, but not for all of us who are on this call. Malia and I not only share some commonalities in terms of our birthplace, which is here in the Hawaiian Islands, but we also attended the same high school, Kamehameha. And we attended the same high school, but we did not know each other as we are a number of years apart in age. And we ended up being brought together by Kelly Miller in Boise, Idaho. Kelly Miller is the director of one of your sister coalitions there in Idaho. And it was Kelly who brought us together. And it is the connections that we happen to make, sometimes on a happenstance matter, that will end up weaving our stories together. I am here in Kalihi Valley on the island of Oahu in the Hawaiian archipelago, a place that my ancestors came to. My Native Hawaiian ancestors came to this place around the year 400 in terms of being able to make that journey on a consistent basis from further down in the Pacific, that place that people call Tahiti and the place that people call New Zealand, which are called other things by the people of those places. And they came upon these islands around the year 400 in a consistent basis. And then my Hakka relations, Aboriginal people from China, and in this case, the south of China, who came here about 230 years ago, relative newcomers as time would go. And here we are in Kalihi Valley. So I'm so very glad to be with you, to be in relationship to you. I hope that at some moment that it will be in person. But in the meanwhile, across time and space, aloha, aloha mai. We beckon the love in.
Aloha, Malia and Norma. Thank you so much for being with us and for introducing yourselves through your stories. We're looking forward to sharing more with you in just a moment. But right now, we'd like to just ask another question in the chat. And so are we ready for another question in the chat? Is that right? Yes, okay. There we go. How does storytelling influence a world beyond violence? How does storytelling influence a world beyond violence?
Alexis, it was so great to hear Malia and Norma share, not go through your bios, but to go through your stories to tell us. And so much, I learned so much more about people from those. So I want to get your sense of from the audience. We want to hear how do you see storytelling playing that role in being without that violence? And Alexis, I see people are thinking it and now they're starting to write in. So it shares a vision of what's possible, hope for building better for our world.
Facts may tell, but stories sell.
It's a personal story that people can understand better than a policy.
Making more space for contributions and wisdom of our ancestors.
Storytelling helps build us strong connections.
It shows, not just tells, and allows us to imagine something that might not be our own version of liberation, but is someone else's liberation, which is just as important.
Bringing your dreams to reality.
Weaves a beautiful tapestry of truth, of experience and wisdom that can create a picture of shared history across cultures and create foundations for possible futures.
Story moves persons towards action.
It promotes empathy and allows people to connect.
Storytelling breaks barriers and connects consciousness that we're all human and should all treat each other as such.
Create space for us to bring our whole selves.
And I know we didn't get a chance to read everyone because they're flying so fast, but what a beautiful, isn't this beautiful, Alexis? Just the sense of how storytelling is actually the enactment of building a world without violence.
And it amazes me, David, how like we know this, like it's in our cellular memory, right? That like stories are like a technology, a foundational technology, an ancestral technology of like our being, our community, our thriving. Like the reason why we're here today, right, is because of what lives in our stories and what has been passed down to us through our stories and what we can create through our stories. And so our audience is like, is here, they're right there with us and know the power of this. And so now our question becomes, how do we leverage this towards the world that we're building, towards the world that we are creating beyond violence?
And I saw Rebecca said we should capture this list and send it out to participants, and we will. In fact, Velena, my colleague, Tori, my colleague, Velena, who is on the call, that's part of what she does, is puts these chats together, and we'll be able to have that available. So for the whole chat for everyone. So we will continue the sharing with everyone.
And Lena said, stories make us feel important.
Well, great. Well, let's move to another story. And I think we're going to start with Malia. And do you want to frame this a little bit, Alexis?
Sure. And so Norma and Malia, you all introduced yourselves, and you located yourself somewhere, right, in a place. You did that first by like speaking in like your language that signals like place and history. And so as we're thinking about how to embody WeGovern principles, there are elements of our stories that are important to that. And so I'm wondering if in conversation, the two of you would talk a little bit about why it's important to narrate a story and the elements of that include people, place, and beings. And why is that important?
Hey, Melia, let's just talk story a little bit.
I would love that.
Okay. The two of us have been doing storytelling for a while, but it always amazes me how much people are drawn to this form, but have really fallen out of practice. And the ways in which, when we fall out of practice of being able to tell stories, that we lose some of the ways in which we can formulate into our creativity. And I know these are things that you think about on a more structured basis than I do. So, I come from a non-academic background in that regard. That's what makes this relationship work so well. So, it's how do you see this happening with your students when they begin to tell a story? What happens to them in terms of their sense of agency?
Norma, I love that question, and it's something that I was thinking about. I teach at an open access community college and here in Boise, Idaho. And one of the essays that I teach in English 101 is a problem solution essay, and they define a major life goal and they figure out what's standing in their way of achieving that. And then they come up with concrete solutions to overcome that obstacle to achieve their goal. And on the first day I write up on the board and I write, a goal without a plan is just a wish. And I've been thinking about that as they start writing and as they start telling their stories of what they imagine for themselves, what they want. And they want things, they want to graduate from school, they want to be a better daughter, they want to be a better mother. I had a student who wrote a beautiful essay about paying closer attention to the natural world and how to get better at paying close attention to the natural world. And what I love when I see my students start to live into these stories, I say, when you write it and when you tell it, it's in the world and you start living it. And the tenor in the classroom changes, the way that they show up in the classroom changes, because they start to feel responsible for their stories, but also to see how the stories from everybody else in the class are interconnected. And that's when I see them show up in their agency and in their power, when they realize how important it is to narrate the stories of this future that they want to live, that's not this abstract time, but putting these practices in to place in the moment as if we can imagine living that future right now.
Malia, I see this also happening in groups of people who are trying to make change in the world together. And often we think of these things in the form of issues, or we think of them in terms of the people that we have to change, as far as, they are the ones who are behaving in a way that we don't want to have happen. And we have to make them see that that isn't something that they should do. Or perhaps we should just compel them to do that by yelling louder than they are. And, that there's this way in which we could be in opposition in a way in which we are unable to figure out how to be in relationship, because we're only about the positions that we have, right? We're only about the positions that we have. And so, I see that the way of narrating, the way of storytelling, as a way for us to begin to build the possibility of something different, right, in what's happening right now, but much more importantly, in what's going to unfold in the future. Because many of the things that we're working on, they're just huge. They've been with us for a long time, and many of them are getting worse. And so how might we figure things out is often in the stories that we're able to build together, and that's something that, both of us have been engaged in the last few years and the last few months together. Hey, Malia, in narrating and in telling a story, right? What is the most surprising thing that people might come across when they begin to try to put their story together?
I was thinking about this when I was thinking about the story that I was going to tell for today. And I had to get out of my own way. And that was surprising to me when I imagine the future. I feel so connected to myself in it. But what I realized when I was practicing my story and getting ready to tell the story of the time that I imagine when my daughter, who's 16 now, is an old woman, that I'm not there in the physical sense when I'm telling this story. But the little things that I'm doing now, that I'm teaching my family, that I notice in my community, those are the things that we can build and grow. And so I think the most surprising thing for me was getting out of my way a little bit to open up the view more clearly, if that makes sense. Norma, what about you? What do you think might be surprising?
A thing that's surprising to me is that both for myself, and I certainly see that in people we work with, that you work with, that I work with, that we work with together. I see that in them, but I also see it in myself, that the more that we are in the practice of telling stories and telling stories together, and not for the purposes of that story somehow being perfected in any way, that the story grows in possibility, becomes bigger, it becomes more complex. It shows different kinds of aspects of things. And that when that happens, that we can actually see in those stories, even though they are future stories, actual things that we need to do today in order to make sure that those stories become real, and we can begin to really trace backwards the course of the action that all of our descendants would need to take long after we're gone, to make that happen as well. So in many ways, it's like casting the biggest net, the farthest to the farthest horizon. And even though I say that, and I know that to be true, it's always a surprise in me when it happens, right? It's a surprise me when it happens, a good surprise that it's happening. So I know today both of us are going to tell future stories. And I sent you a little note last night, and Alexis a note that yesterday, just sitting and preparing for today, what came to me is a new chapter in a story that I have told before. And today will be the first time that I will say this story aloud. And my style is I don't write the details of the story before I narrate it. I let it just spill out. And it may have to spill out many times before it ever gets written down. So I just have a few bullet points here, I have a few bullet points here on my paper. And and we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. Hey, Alexis, you let us know if we should start or not.
I'm so excited to get into the stories. Malia, we have you up first. So are you ready? And so some framing for just for our audience for context is that we have just asked you and Norma to like feel into whatever place it is in you that these stories live and tell a story about the people, the beings, and the place you are committed to in relation to embodying WeGovern in your life. Yeah, take it away, Malia.
Alexis, thank you. It all starts with the sound of birds. And I've been thinking about birds and bird sounds and how the air and the space sounds when I call home to my family in Hawaii. And I was talking with my sister on the phone yesterday and I could hear the bird sounds. And on my drive into work, I was looking for a particular sound of a honey creeper. And I was playing it before I left home. And when I got into the car and I turned on the car, my phone hooked to the car stereo and the sound of the Hawaiian honey creeper started coming out of the stereo. And I love when a first line appears, and that first line that it starts with the sound of birds. And the story that I'm narrating is with a character, and her name is Mehana, which means the child born into warmth. Mehana remembers the story even now as an old woman, living on the land of her mother and her grandmother and her great-grandmother and her great-great-grandmother. Today, she's thinking back nearly 70 years before, and she remembers she was 14 on the day the story comes to her, and she was 14 when her grandfather died. And the day before his memorial service, her family drove deep into the Waiahole Valley to a family friend's house, a place she goes back to now with her children and their grandchildren, the cousins, the friends, the community. And they walk around the Lo'ikalo, the valley filled with ferns and farms and food, and this place that has become their kuleana, a place to take care of the land, to grow food for this part of the island. But before all of the changes, before that day, all of those years ago, there was her family and her mother. And it was her mother who took them to a bluff overlooking the Waiahole stream. And for the memorial service for her grandfather, they picked ferns, they picked lauae and palapalai, tea leaves and ginger, yellow ginger and torch ginger. Her mother taught them where to cut the leaves or the stems, the way her father taught her to, the way Mehana taught her family to, and all these families in the valley. And she remembers how on that day, they stacked the cut ferns and flowers in the middle of where they stood. And a honey creeper flew in and landed on the branches of the guava tree and started singing. And Mehana could feel that song inside of her. She knew the gestures of tending to the ferns and to the flowers, the sense memory of these practices. She could feel the land they were on and the stories held inside of it. Her ancestors were in the birds and the ferns. They were in the wind and the rain that started high in the mountains and moved into the valleys, the way the wind could punctuate the story. She was telling and moving and hearing the wind, sometimes more vividly than a person's voice. And she remembers asking herself, is it the wind or is it the sound of a voice of someone loved who's passed? Was it the honey creeper's bird song, the single trill of it back in those days? How lucky they were to hear that one honey creeper. And now, because they took care, because they tended, the forests are filled with the sounds of birds who will come back. That day, her hands became the words that her heart already knew. The words tending, the words taking care, the words longing and belonging. That day she understood for the first time what her kuleana was. She felt it in her lungs like breath. She knew she carried everything that she needed already, and it was inside of her. And after that day, and 6 months later when the pandemic hit, and a year and a half later, when she went home for that first summer, that summer of 2021, when they closed down the hike to the waterfall that everybody was hiking to. And there was a great cry and an outcry by all of these people who wanted that place, but who didn't take care of it. They said, give it back, let us come, give it back, let us come. So many footfalls and hand grabs, mud and dirt and rock scattered across the path and the roads. And they closed down the waterfall. And they closed down the waterfall and the road to the house where Liliuokalani wrote her song, filled with longing for the place as she knew it and as she dreamed it. Aloha oi, she wrote those words, and that melody that came to her as she rode over the Ko'olau Mountains, back along what they now call the Old Pali Road, back to her house in town. Over the Old Pali Road, lava rock and stone, the old road that connected the wet side of the island to the dry side. And when they closed that waterfall and people couldn't come in anymore, the trees grew back and the ferns, the maile that had grown abundant in all those years before that had been pulled or picked was now back. The smell of the maile that filled the yards, that filled the streets, that filled the air, the mountains, even the clouds. The air in the valley smelled like moss. It smelled like fern and mountain apples, like guava and maile, like ohia lehua, like liko lehua, earth and mountain flank and water. The water in the pools, once they closed down the hike to the waterfall, the water in the pools and the waterfalls clear, back against and full in the chutes and crevices and the mountains. So much water back. She learned that place from her mother and her mother's mother, who learned it from the daughter of her great-great-grandfather. And the story was that they loved this place so much when their babies were babies. And they wanted their babies to know this place in their blood and in their bones. They knew they wanted these babies to know a place in their bodies, that the sounds and smells of this place would live inside of them in their own sense memory of a place that was lost for so long because it belonged to people who didn't take care. And when they said, we want you to see this place as it was once told to me, the place dreamed to me in mele and chant. And once the waterfall was closed and the birds came back, and then the oopu and the shrimp, and the trees grew back stronger and fuller than before. And the girl, Mehana, the family name of this family of Hawaiians. Mehana, she could speak fluent Hawaiian and her chanting was known throughout the valley. And she hiked in the valley below the face of the Ko'ola Mountains. And she sang the stories that she learned, and she chanted with pieces of bird song inside of her. And she knew the way even without knowing that she knew it, because she learned it in her body. Her body, a forest body, her body, a mountain body, a waterfall body, and a stream body, an ocean body. Underneath her hands as she walked, she felt the blossoms of the Alima flowers, back and full, bright orange, the color of tiny suns, wild in their joy. And that morning, she's sitting there and she's thinking about her story, and she's thinking about this place and this place they loved that so easily could have been lost, that they saved. And she remembers when she knew what she needed to do to save this place, so everyone who came after could know the beauty of the people and of the beings and what was there. And even now, all these years past, she remembers that summer before she was cutting ferns for her grandfather's memorial service. And she was 13 years old on her first huaka'i, on her first trip to Kaho'olawe. And on that first night, when they were telling everybody what they needed to do, they said, you need to remember two things: pay attention and watch each other. And those two ideas she carried with her, and she taught, and she did, and she paid attention to the world around her. She paid attention to each other, to other people. And that island of Kaho'olawe is now healed. The water table mended, fresh water running through the island. And when she thinks how that place came to be, she remembers the chants and the prayers that she learned all those years ago. The chants they chanted to get onto Hakioava, the chants that they chanted in the ocean, the chants that they chanted on shore, the ones that she chanted the morning they scattered her grandfather's ashes when no one knew what to do, and the words in that chant, when she needed them, they came to her. And the stories of those chants and the language of those chants, before known by few people, is now a language that connects people throughout each of the Hawaiian Islands. And those chants that you only heard ever so often are now heard throughout the day. Young voices, old voices. And throughout the day, the voices call out and the bird songs meet them. And the chant that she remembers that takes her back to the place where the big change started, she feels inside of her, and she feels it in her fingers, and she feels it in her voice. When she says, "E ulu I kalani, growth to the heavens. E ulu I ka honua, growth to the earth. E ulu I ka pai aina o Hawaii, growth to the islands of Hawaii. E ho mai ka ike, grant knowledge. E ho mai ka ikaika, grant strength. E ho mai ka akamai, grant intelligence. E ho mai ka maupopo pona, grant divine understanding. E ho mai ka ike papalua, grant intuitive insight. E ho mai Kamana, Grant Mana. Those words she feels, those words she hears inside of her, in the voices, in the wind. Thank you.
I know we're not all on camera together, but can we just take a breath? Just take a breath and breathe in that story. Thank you so much, Malia. So much of you, so much of your people, so much of your descendants and your beings, and the places that you care for, that for generations your people have been caring for, was offered to us in your story with deep gratitude. Mahalo. Folks that are listening and witnessing these stories, what say you about your people and your places and your beings? When you think about creating a world, my being, when you think about creating space, creating a world beyond violence, where this vision of thriving that you all were sharing in the chat at the beginning of the call, like, it becomes real. Who are you doing that with? Who are you building this world with? Where's your place? Who are your people? Who are your beings? Can you share with us in the chat?
Thank you for sharing Alexis Bones's voice with us. And love to hear from all of you. What is your place? Who are your people and their beings?
Farmers of Friesland, my body is my place, healing and honoring the sensor and sense maker that carries me through life. My native land of Bioko Island, that is 88 degrees year round with beaches and beautiful water sources. My Booby people are harvesting yams and palm oil. Those who know me well know why I'm crying right now. My place is from the emotional pain my family, earlier generations that raised me. You know, I'll share so that this isn't awkward. I've been in a process for many years of trying to reconnect with my ancestral roots and to reestablish connection with place and people, being a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade, and learned just a few short years ago that my people are from Bioko Island, and so they're the Booby people of Bioko Island. And so, Jacqueline, that moved me deeply. My place spans across borders. It's all this continent. I'm healing, but healing by myself with no one around me. My native lands are in Sonora, Mexico. Then my people migrated to New Mexico and Arizona, places where my people have touched every place they've dreamed at and through. My place is a feeling, a sense, a living. My place is in my Bubby's laughter and her righteous anger, in the swamps of Louisiana, in the gardens of Alabama, in the cement, the dirt and oil from Ghana, China, and spanning further towards and sometimes against. Absolutely, Jacqueline. I grew up between two cultures and two countries. I don't feel that either place is quite mine. Thank you, Rocky. All right. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for the for like sharing the mixed experiences of people in place, right? And the mixed relationships, the various kinds of relationships that we have with people in place. We're going to turn to Norma now. Norma, we're going to invite you in to tell us your story of your people and places and beings that you feel called to embody WeGovern among.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you so much. Hey, Malia. Mahalo nui. Thank you so much, Malia. Malia, you know that in some of the stories that I tell that your children are in them and your descendants of your children are in them. But this chapter that I'm going to speak for the first time today takes place actually 100 years after the story that I am been talking about over the last few years. So you and Alexis and David have heard portions of this long story, and this one really jumps forward to 100 years. A little bit of context too is that this time of year, I'm always thinking about two things. One is that in a couple of months, we will come upon that moment in history again, yet another anniversary of the time in which the native people of this land lost their worldly governance, their political and authoritative ability to be able to be the known and chosen leaders of this land. And that always comes upon me as we enter into this time period, into the January time period. And also this time of the year also puts me into the makahiki, the seasonal part of the year in which our people, especially before Western contact, but many to this day, that they will take this time to pause. And it is a period of 4 moons that begins in November, the makahiki period, to pause and to reflect, to give thanks, to rest, to celebrate, and to mourn fruitfully, in which we are not sitting in the drama of our mourning, but to put the tears back into the land. And this is the period of the makahiki. So my story takes place at that time. I'm going to switch to gallery view because if I were in a room, I would be seeing all of you. And I know that most of you are just names on this because you have chosen not to put your camera on. But I'm going to make sure that David and Alexis and Malia are in my sight so that you can be in front of me as I tell the story. So the story takes place 171 years forward from now. It's November of 2192, the beginning of the makahiki season, that period in which we will pause. The entire community these days, not only the native people, the Kanaka Maoli, the native Hawaiians, but all of the people take this opportunity to pause, even if momentarily, to give gratitude, to take notice of the land and the people around them, to eat and share good foods, to do the ceremonies, not only the ceremonies of the native people, but of all of the cultures that have migrated to this place, that the Makahiki has become a mingled place that is special to the islands, that has as its root native culture, but is really of this place now, all the people of this place. And here in November of 2192, the native governor, who is the leader chosen from this place, the islands, and who shares leadership of the Pacific Islands all across the expanse of the Pacific, along with other native leaders of the Pacific. That the native governor, she and the descendants of migrant people who have migrated to this place of Hawaii, and the descendants of those peoples. And every year that number will change. People will come forward and in their mixed ancestry represent the 35, 40 nations and cultural places that people have chosen to come from to live in this place, Hawaii. And this year, there are only 8 people representing the 40 nations and cultures, all of mixed ancestry streaming through them. Several of them having only come upon the stories of their ancestors just recently, and so could add a few more countries and cultures into their storyline. And the 8 of them and the native governor descended down that well, that cave, that shaft deep in Halava Valley. It used to be known as the Halava Shaft, and it's now known as Ernie's Water Shaft, named after that engineer back in the year 2021, 2022. Heroically, and through the knowledge that he had as a person who had responsibility of the water, as an engineer, but also as a person who had migrated to this place, whose ancestors came from many places, who heroically and with resolve told the story of the water and what would need to be done to protect the aquifer when we're in a moment of potential catastrophe, because the underground storage tanks that had been built in the 1940s to hold fuel had begun to leak into the ground and endangered the aquifer. And he was the one who helped us reclaim that aquifer. And it took many years from that point in time. But now this water shaft is known as Ernie's Water Shaft. And they've gone to this place to take a gourd on a long Senate cord from the island of Satawal, which is the birthplace of Mao. Mao, who taught us in the 1970s how to reclaim our ways of navigating the Pacific without instruments. And the Senate cord tied to this gourd, put down into the water shaft to bring up from the aquifer water that had percolated over many decades, and to draw that water ceremoniously above the ground. And there were prayers and chants and laughter and food celebrated over this water. And then put together in a calabash with salt that for 500 years have been made on the island of Kauai, in the salt fields of Hanapepe, with fish dried in the old ways from the island of Molokai, and from a lei of feathers of mamo from the island of Maui, who were last seen in 1898, but they were only hiding Everyone thought they were extinct, but they were only hiding. And with the lei, the salt, the dried fish, and the water from this well, taken and carried preciously to the island of Hawaii. And there they would be greeted by the people of that place who were in Makahiki, this great gathering of indigenous and Western scientists and astronomers. That time that it took, many decades, for culture and science not to be held separately, but brought together. And now every year during the Makahiki, they meet not to have political conversation, but to meet to exchange new findings that they're discovering across the course of the ways, the many ways that we may see the heavens and what the heavens may be able to share with us. And in an exciting way, the scientists from Germany and a scientist from the Aboriginal lands of Australia reporting that they can actually measure the multiverse. They can measure the multiverse and they can have glimpses of what it is that may be able to be communicated across the multiverse. And they would take this and they would take a drop of the water from this gourd and they would leave it upon the land. And then this water would be taken along with an adze from the quarry up on the mauna of Akea. And it would drawing the salt from Kauai, the dried fish from Molokai, the feather lei from Maui. And it would be taken then to the island of Kaho'olawe, this place that was struggled over, this place that they had begun the cleanup in the 1990s of landmines and bombardments, this land that had been used by the Allied forces since 1939 up until the early 1980s as a place for target practice by the military forces of the West. That this place that had been rejuvenated, that had been restored, that since 3 seasons before 100 years of this story had started to have a rainy season every year. And so now for 103 years, there's been a rainy season. This water, along with the adze, the salt, the dried fish, and the feathered lei, greeted at this place. The Makahiki, especially joyous this year because just earlier in March of this year, the very last of the pieces of the bombs that had been dropped, oh, so many years ago, hundreds of years ago. It has taken 198 years, but the last of those armaments had been discovered deep under the ground and had been removed with great ceremony and had been removed from the land like the last of a splinter taken from the body of Earth. And it had been taken ceremoniously out of the land in March of this year. And the descendants of the people that had been a part of that cleanup so many years ago, 198 years ago, from the Patekolawe Ohana, from the US military, the civilian leaders of that time, the descendant of the mayor of Maui County, Hannibal Tavares, a man of Portuguese ancestry who had stood firm as a Republican that the bombing must be stopped. The descendants of all these people met in Makahiki to give thanks for all of that effort. Never forgotten the splinter taken out of the land. And it was telling that half of the descendants of the people who were descendants of the US military at that time are now part of the multinational force of people who are assisting in the bringing back life into all of the oceans. That this is what has come of 3/4 of the military forces of the world, not yet completely disassembled, but 3/4 of the forces have now taken on the mission of the rejuvenation of the vast places that are not easily traveled. The ocean surface, the ocean depths, into the mountains where no people have gone, into the deserts, to bring back life and to take out the opala, the rubbish. That this has become the mission of the many military forces of the world. And say they would have that celebration along with the salt from Kauai, the fish from Molokai, the feather lei from Maui, the water drawn from Ernie's well, the ads from the mountain, Mauna Avakea, and now brought together by this consecrated last splinter, along with the seeds of the iliahi that are now coming and blowing across in the wind stream, coming upon this place, and the seed of the iliahi and the water now taken back to the island of Oahu. Oahu to Kualoa, the new Kualoa, reestablished after the waters had come up from the sea level rise and had receded, to be put into this Ava ceremony, to hear the presentation by the keiki, the children of the land, who had, together with the elders of that land, come together over an entire year, customarily chosen on an annual basis, to give the state of the island's address. What state, what condition are we in? What needs to be done? What is our work? What is our work? And their stories and their songs and their poems and their drawings being added now to this precious, precious bundle, taken back into the hills of Maui. Water given and the seedling from the island of Ko'olave, replanted on the mountain of Maui. The side of the mountains where now a forest grows, that water may fall, and with such abundance that the wind will carry the water across the channel, that there may always be a rainy season on the island of Ko'olave. Hui, opau, e ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai.
So shall it be. Thank you, Norma. Thank you so much. Thank you, Norma, and thank you, Malia, Friends, what reflections, what inspirations, what calls to action are stirring in you as you are taking in these stories? And take a beat and breathe in Norma's story as well as you're reflecting on this question in the chat. Yeah, that we need to move forward, prioritizing the time it takes to tell stories and really listen to stories. To always bring elements and more than human beings into our work. To really start creative writing more, to relive or relieve some of my personal heartache. And as you're writing and as you're thinking about what other reflections, what other calls to action, I would like to invite Norma and Malia to come back and to talk story about your stories together. As you all are reflecting on the elements of your stories and what becomes possible through telling these stories. Also to our audience, if you all have questions for Norma and Malia, feel free to pop them in there. They're going to be talking story. David and I will be reading the questions, and we'll like pop them in if there's a if there's a break that gives us a chance to do that. Malia, Norma.
Norma, oh my God, I had chicken skin. And I was thinking, I was listening to you and I was thinking about your story and how perfectly it embodies what we're talking about when we talk about WeGovern, and how it's so much towards hope and how it can feel hard sometimes. And I think about what's going on in Hawaii right now with the water and Red Hill. And I think I focus on that and the lens of what can happen when we work together, when we take care. It kept going towards hope. And that's something that I need to remind myself to do, that writing towards hope or the storytelling towards hope. It can seem hard to get there sometimes. And listening to your story, I remembered the possibility of what can happen when we do it.
You know, Malia, if I were to write the story, or actually if you were to write the story, if I were to just tell the story, your story on a written form would be many, many, many volumes. And my oral story, you'd have to take many intermissions in order to tell it and to hear it. If we were to include the terrible times as well as the hopeful times, right? And one of the reasons why it would take so long is because we could get so trapped in the terrible times of that story that we might not be able to see our way into how that tide turned, right? How the tide turned. And if we are to have agency, if we are to have freedom, then we have to be able to be the people who basically course correct, right? Change the course of the trajectory from tragedy to thriving. Not even survivorship to thriving, but from tragedy to thriving. And so a strategy that I use is that I pick a place in the story after the work is done. I'm not picking a place in the story as if there's no work that's needed, but it's like after the work, the hard work and the challenges. And what that helps me to do is it helps me to understand what kind of work has to occur and what kind of decisions would have to be made. You know, like Ernie Lau, the engineer at the Board of Water Supply today, literally, he's a real man. Right now, this real man is making a really hard decision about whether or not he steps outside the authority that he's supposed to have, right? His job title, you know, the whatever it is by law he can do. And in order to provide only the leadership that he can provide, even if he isn't certain about it, how to step forward. And he's trying to make that decision, right? And that decision is going to be consequential if his descendants are going to draw water from that well, right? And so it helps me to see both the human decisions as well as the systems decisions, right, that would have to be made. So that's why, as a matter of strategy, I try to choose that place. And, you know, clearly, right, a lot of work, right, 198 years to finally clean up Ko'olawe, but we have to like keep at it and not lose sight how important that is. So some group of peoples would have had to have kept doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. And some groups of peoples would have had to have supported that, right? So that's my strategy and I'm sticking to it. Hey, Malia, you know, I am thinking as that we may have to join forces because you're the writer and I'm the oral one. And we actually, I think it might be fun. You as the writer, me as the oral storyteller. And then we get a bunch of people who only tell story with pictures. And we do it on a relay basis.
Yes.
We tell a story in the commons on a relay basis, you know, and just do that over several days. Yeah, that'll be fun.
I would love that. I was thinking, Norma, when you were telling your story, because I've heard you tell stories, your long story. And I think what's so amazing is that you're building this story one day and the next day something changes and the story has space for that. And I remember you talking about when you tell your story, when you first start narrating into and telling your story, it's not going to be crystal clear. But the more you tell it and the more space you give it and you give yourself, then it starts to the story starts to reveal itself to you. And I was thinking about the story that you're telling, the chapter of the story you're telling today is, I mean, unfolding like minute by minute. And there's space in the story for that, and the expansiveness of story that can encompass so many things. I think sometimes I focus smaller, and listening to your story reminds me of the need to give space and that things are going to change, and also what we're called to pay attention to changes and paying attention to what's calling us to pay attention to.
Yes, you know, it's when we're in this place where we are relearning how to be a different type of leader, a different type of community, when many institutions are collapsing, even the ones that we may have given birth to, that they cannot hold up to the chaos of these times. And so it's to stay in as fertile a ground, a possibility as possible is really important. And part of that reason is so that we can figure out how to be in relationship to each other's gifts, right? That you may very well have somebody on this call may very well have something that they don't know that they know that will be important for us to put together in order to just do mundane kinds of things as we refigure out how to not have stability during this chaos, but how for our people to move, like into their own possibility, right? And to help each other out. I know there's a big criticism of this thing called, mutual aid, but I think of mutual aid on scale would mean that we would become interlocking communities of such possibility that even if nations fall apart, we will be okay. I mean, like at that scale. And for that, we need some really big stories, really big stories. Hey,
Well,
I know
that's
Alexis are going to take it away from us now.
I mean, that was a mic drop moment. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Those interlocking stories of mutual care of such scale that even if nations collapse, we are going to be all right. I want to be that. I want to be in building that story. Friends, having listened to these stories, having listened to, just witnessed the possibility in this technology, in witnessing stories and telling stories, what's one action you can take today to plan for a future without violence? Like, what else has shown up on your radar as possible?
I know we're going into our final minutes here, but I really think that I'm so inspired to thinking about how, the stories of capturing both the tragedy and the aspiration, and that's where we can move forward and think about those next steps of how to tell story. And and why we need to continue telling story. So please go ahead and share. We'd love to hear what actions you're looking to be taking. And I want to really thank so much Malia Collins and Norma Wong for sharing their stories with us. I want to really thank all of you who have shared so much in this chat and shared so much. And I feel the connections. We are literally learned that we shared ancestral land this session, literally. And I want to really thank Alexis and Resonance Network. Many Resonance Network staff and members are part of this session today for being able to really bring what we do together. And as we do the next steps, we will be having another WeGovern web conference coming up in 2022. So conversation is continuing. Please go to WeGovern website and sign up to get updates of the work that they're doing. Thank you for sharing the actions that you are doing. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. Alexis, any last words that you want to say?
No, just thank you, David. Thank you, Tori, for holding this space for us. Thank you, Norma. Thank you, Malia, for like just sharing your gifts in this profound invitation into narrating our stories. If you want to be more deeply connected with the work of WeGovern, make sure that you click that link in the chat and sign on. Once you have signed on, you'll be on the email list that gets notifications of other events that are happening related to WeGovern, and we want to make sure that you get those invitations. Thank you, David.
Thank you. We'll keep the chat open for a couple more minutes, though we'll be moving many of you into the waiting room. So this is your last chance to get your chat. Speakers, please stay on for just a few minutes.